Hello everyone, I'm Adharmic, and welcome to the second part in a series in which I develop a sci-fi, Star Fox-inspired computer-y space shooter using primarily Unity, Blender, and Photoshop. Before we get started, I'd like to apologize for the long hiatus. Between finishing my last semester of college, beginning to work full-time, and moving to a new place, I've been scrambling for both the time and motivation to work on this passion project of mine. In our last video, I ended the devlog after finalizing the main aesthetics of the game. Now that I had a pretty good idea of how I wanted the game to look, I decided it was time to actually implement some more mechanics. Of course, collision is a big part of any game with an aerial piloting focus. Otherwise, what would be the point of all these big, colorful obstacles I so painstakingly designed? So, I got to work on a quick collision script and gave each of the environment prefabs meshes to register when the character mesh overlaps with an obstacle. When it sees an overlap, the script activates and reduces the player's health. To represent this damage taken visually, I put together a health bar and also added some visual effects via scripting to show the player that they've just bonked into the environment. It's just some classic screen shake and a strobing toggle on the player's ship's visibility, which is a tactic used in a ton of games to show when damage is taken. The health bar graphic is definitely placeholder. I really just slapped it together to check if the health system was working. Now that some basic collision was up, I felt it was time to add something to actually shoot at. Our first enemy. The basic enemy I designed was a flying enemy that's meant to hover around the player, circling them and occasionally firing projectiles. With this enemy, my first concern was visual design, which I modeled after a standard bacteriophage. I wanted to give it the impression of a computer virus by basing it off of a virus that actually affects humans. I might continue modeling different enemies based on other real-world diseases or even insects. I think it's a cool and humorous way to represent computer viruses and bugs. I turned the legs of the bacteriophage into rotor blades to fit its behavior of hovering near the player, and then I applied a simple script to rotate these blade legs continuously around the body, giving it the impression of a helicopter. I also gave the phage a turret-like barrel for the purpose of firing at the player character. For flair, I went ahead and added a simple script that would make the phage bob up and down a bit, to really give that impression of a floating creature. Similarly, I gave the barrel a script that would have it constantly aiming at the player character, always ready to open fire. And there I go again, working on aesthetics rather than core mechanics. Alright, let's work on some actual enemy behavior. My idea for this enemy was that it would bounce horizontally across the player's view frame, firing at the character every couple of seconds. Since it's supposed to be a first enemy, I didn't want it to be too complex with a lot of various behavioral patterns. I also wanted to make sure that the enemy would stay visible in the player's viewpoint at all times, to ramp up the annoying gnat feeling of a flying enemy that just won't leave you alone. So I wrote a script to keep the enemy bouncing from side to side on the screen with a little screen coordinate world coordinate math. Since the view frame we see is a two-dimensional projection of a three-dimensional space of the game world, there's a little bit of conversion that has to be done based on the coordinates of the game world and the coordinates of the screen to make them correspond. With that math done, the phage seems to be mostly functional, bouncing across the screen and encircling the ore wing. There is a slight bug where sometimes the enemy makes it past the screen boundary and then never appears in view again, probably because it's bouncing outside the view frame this time, so I'm trying to think of better ways to handle that. I may end up using rotational math to keep the phage bouncing within a certain degree range on an invisible sphere that encapsulates the ore wing. Next, I added a quick shooting script with a decent delay to make the phage a more manageable enemy. The shooting works fine for the most part, but the phage kinda shoots like a stormtrooper and rarely hits the player. In turn though, hitting the phage is also really difficult, so it works out. Welcome to Game Balancing 101. Just kidding, of course. I did end up refactoring the shooting system to use a form of ray tracing, but I think the excessive accuracy detracts from the enjoyability of the game as it is really tough to hit moving targets. I'm not sure how to handle this issue quite yet, so I'm going to look into other space or aerial shooting games to see the techniques other developers use to handle their projectiles and collisions. Finally, to finish the phage, I had to actually spawn the thing in. This was a tricky thing to come up with. I wanted to go about it my own way, so I abstained from seeing what techniques other developers use for spawning enemies. My solution feels pretty hacky, but it seems to work so far. Rather than having the phage fly towards the player character once in range, I instead had the phage be part of the actual player group. It would be inactive and invisible, but the enemy prefab would be flying along with the player character the entire time. Then I created a trigger zone that would enable the phage, activating its behavior scripts and making it visible again. If I end up going through with this plan, I'll have to use some sort of shader to make the phage sort of phase into reality, kind of like a glitch in the system. Effectively, how it ends up working is that the player will fly into one of the trigger zones and the phage begins hovering around the player, still flying along with them because the phage is a part of the player character group. I think this approach has multiple benefits, like being able to recycle this enemy very easily by deactivating it when it dies and reactivating it when the player enters another trigger zone. But that might be more complicated when it comes to adding multiple enemies at the same time. But no matter what, I'm going to keep experimenting with various ways to make this work. I feel like part of this process is messing around to see what feels good gameplay-wise. Thank you all for watching. It feels really good to be getting back into game dev, and I hope you'll stick around to see more of the progress on this game. The best way to keep informed is, of course, to subscribe. Here's to hoping I'll have a name for this game by the next devlog. Bye, and see you next time.